My name is Nora Bennett, 35, and on the morning of my brother's wedding, I zipped into a mustard bridesmaid dress, tucked a beat-up Safeway stockroom Polaroid into my wallet, silenced a call from my mother that sounded like manners dressed as judgment, and watched my phone count down to a board. Briefing an ocean away by dinner, a lazy rumor from our family chat had drifted into the ballroom, and my brother's toast tried to nail me to the word disappointment. While a few polite laughs skimmed the tables, I chose to sit still and breathe, because sometimes quiet is stronger than a speech. And then the best man crossed the room, said my name with a steadiness that made the music hesitate, and introduced himself in a way that turned every head. "What do you think?" he said. "And how can one sentence and a ticking clock change a family story?" Stay with me, and I will show you the moment the room shifted and the facts that did the lifting without me ever raising my voice. Rain slid down the window of my South Lake Union apartment in thin sheets, the kind that makes the city smell like steel and cedar. The mustard bridesmaid dress hung on the closet door and glowed like a caution sign. Olivia had picked it, said it would photograph well against the ballroom lighting. I stood there barefoot with coffee cooling in my hand and tried to decide if the color made me look brave or simply foolish. On the vanity, a small Polaroid waited for me the way an old friend does. It was from 2015. I was in a Safeway stockroom at 2 a.m. with a hairnet and a barcode scanner, grinning like I had just figured out a secret. I had. Watching pallets move and produce ripen under bad lights taught me more about supply chains than a dozen consultants ever could. My phone buzzed with that ringtone. I never changed because some habits are anchors. My mother. I answered and braced. She began with the weather and slid into reminders. Wear something appropriate. Do not make the family uncomfortable. Try not to talk about work. Her voice had that careful softness that always meant judgment wrapped as concern. I let her speak until the old comparisons surfaced like a stain that never washed out. Caleb made such steady choices. Caleb never courted attention. I felt my jaw tighten. I told her I would see her at the hotel. Then I pressed the end call and listened to the silence settle like a curtain. On my calendar, the block glowed red. 7 p.m. in Seattle, 10 a.m. in Singapore. Board briefing for the Quan Pacific deal. $1.6 billion. We needed our approvals locked before the midday disclosure window in Singapore between 12 and 1. If we slipped, closing would slide, and we would lose momentum we had earned inch by inch. The clock on the stove read just after 8. There was room for a shower, a sensible breakfast, and a quiet ride to the Fairmont. Another buzz. Tessa Monroe. She had screenshotted a thread from the family group chat that the cousins used for potlucks and baby photos. Someone had written that I was on food stamps again. The words sat there without punctuation, lazy gossip in casual clothes. Tessa followed with a short note. She had confirmed the message came from inside the group, not public, and she recommended we log it and prepare a targeted retraction rather than a broad response. I told her to do just that. No flames, no speeches. I wanted the truth to stand on its own legs. I texted Ethan Reyes. He was already at the Fairmont with the groomsmen. 2 hats for one head today. Best man, because he and Caleb had shared dorm instant noodles and bad guitars, director of executive protection. Because I had put my life and company in his hands more than once, and he had carried both without dropping them. I reminded him of the schedule, the route, the quiet exit option if we needed it. I wrote that any intervention should be minimal and respectful. He replied that the code phrase stood the one we had agreed on months ago after a charity gala went sideways. I pictured him in a tux pulling security eyes from the corners of the room and felt a little calmer. I dressed for the weather and then for the day. The dress went on last because I had to talk myself into it. The color sat on my skin like a dare. I clipped my hair back, slid the Polaroid into the card slot of my wallet, and told myself that carrying it was not nostalgia. It was a compass. I took a breath and looked at the calendar block again. 7 in Seattle, 10 in Singapore. Midday disclosure window. The math lined up. The stakes were clear. The rideshare dropped me at the curb where the hotel canopy pushed the rain into a clean arc. Inside the lobby, I felt the hush of soft carpets and money. Wedding flowers leaned like they were listening. I checked my phone. Tessa had sent one more update. The rumor was contained to the family group for now. She would prepare the retraction to all recipients through the wedding mailing list if needed. Good. Precision over spectacle. I watched families thread through the space like different rivers converging and decided to stay small. The day belonged to two people who were not me. I could be present without performing. My mother always said family is a mirror. I have learned that sometimes it is a funhouse one. You can spend years arguing with the distortions, or you can stand up straight and let the reflection be wrong without letting it define you. The elevator hummed. I rode up with a tray of champagne and a bellman who guessed correctly that I was with the bridal party. He offered congratulations. I offered a smile that was polite and intact. In the suite, the bustle had already begun. I hung the dress on a hook and checked the line of the hem. My phone buzzed yet again. Ethan. Confirmed head count. Confirmed the ceremony timeline. Confirmed he had notified both sides about his professional role today to avoid surprises. I typed a simple acknowledgement. I knew he would not move unless the line was crossed. I also knew that lines have a way of shifting in families when nerves and microphones get involved. I ate a handful of almonds I found in my tote and took one last look at the Polaroid before I slid it deeper into my wallet. I remembered the hum of the walk-in cooler and the way my breath had fogged when I opened the door for the first time. I remembered loading bananas until my shoulders burned and learning the cadence of demand that would one day become algorithms and distribution maps and the exact right time to move a truck so nothing spoiled and no one noticed. That work taught me to be invisible on purpose. Today would test whether I could remain visible on my own terms. I glanced at the clock again. The morning was already tilting toward the afternoon. The dress waited. The rain eased. I zipped up the mustard silk and thought it looked like a bruise before it heals, and that felt true. Then I smoothed the fabric, picked up my clutch, and opened the door to the hallway, ready to see who I was expected to be and determined to remain who I am. The lobby of the Fairmont held the kind of quiet that money buys. Brass fixtures gleamed lilies threw a careful sweetness into the air, and the rain outside stayed politely on the other side of the revolving door. I checked the event board and followed the small arrows that promised the Whitfield Bennett wedding would be beautiful and on time. Olivia found me first. She moved like a person who believed the day would bend for her if needed, dressed in a pale pearl that made my mustard look louder than it already was. She kissed my cheek and told me I looked pretty, and then asked if the color was photographed well. I said it would do fine, and asked if she needed anything. She brightened and said Sarah was looking for another set of hands. Sarah Lynn was in the suite, with a curling iron in one hand and a spreadsheet in her head if I had to guess. She had the energy of a person who managed operating rooms and toddlers with the same calm cadence. She thanked me for grabbing bobby pins and asked how I was balancing work travel with family events. Her tone was curious without being cruel. I kept my answers short. West Coast most weeks. Singapore this quarter has more than usual. I mentioned weather and logistics and left the rest in the quiet. She smiled like she understood that some people carry whole lives inside a single sentence. The bridesmaids filtered in and out. Conversation drifted the way it does when strangers are bound by dresses and duty. Someone described a villa rental in Tuscany. Someone else asked about ski season dates. When they turned to me, I offered a gentle, "No plan yet." My calendar is chosen these days. No one pressed. It was not malice. It was momentum. The day belonged to Olivia and Caleb, and the machine around them had to keep turning. A call came over the house system that the groomsmen were to report for lineup at 10. The words settled my shoulders a fraction because I knew what that meant. Ethan would be where the eyes were, and I would have a pocket of hallway to breathe. I slipped out to the corridor to check the route map Ethan had sent that morning. Service elevator to the mezzanine to the side stairs. Side stairs to the ballroom corridor. The path in my head felt like a string I could pull if I needed to leave quickly and kindly. That was when I saw him at the far end of the hall. Ethan in a tuxedo did not look like security, and that was the point. He looked like every other best man until you caught the scan of his eyes and the way his hands knew where to rest. He spotted me and paused just enough to ask if the schedule still held. I told him it did. Briefing before the timing window. He nodded once and said he had already notified both sides about his professional role to avoid surprises. He added that he would only step in if the line around safety or dignity was crossed. We both knew those lines move at weddings. I reminded him of the phrase we had tested at the gala. "Ms. Bennett, shall we leave?" Hearing it in a tux made it feel like a velvet rope instead of a fire alarm. The coordinator rounded the corner with a clipboard and 1,000 priorities. She asked if I could join the group photo at the landing in 5. I followed her down and met the photographer Marco Diaz, a kind-looking man whose hands never stopped adjusting things. He arranged us by height then, by color, then by what he called visual balance. He placed Olivia at the center, and then swept us out like wings. When I ended up near the edge, he offered an apologetic half-smile and told me the palette would be smoother if the mustard anchored the frame. I nodded. He was not unkind. He was building an image the way people do when they think of harmony as symmetry. Olivia glanced back and told me to step in a bit more. The train of her dress needed space and my dress was making a bright border. I stepped where she pointed. The flash popped, and I counted breaths instead of the seconds. Somewhere a violinist was tuning to an A that seemed to hover in the woodwork. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs with the other groomsmen. For a moment the old university laugh lit his face, and then the professional stillness returned. The master of ceremonies called for the groomsmen line up in the anteroom near the ballroom. Ethan met my eyes and asked quietly if I was all right. I told him I was solid. He reminded me that he would be at the head table only for the toasts, and that the team had eyes on the side corridors if I needed a clean exit. I told him the route was in my pocket. Marco asked for one more set. He wanted a candid with the bridesmaids looking toward Olivia while she looked at Caleb. We took our positions, and the room narrowed to the frame he imagined. The coordinator counted 3, and the shutters stuttered like wings. From the ballroom, we heard the MC run through the order of the ceremony and the note about phones that every wedding needs. People began to move in purposeful streams. Ethan lifted 2 fingers in a small salute that meant, "I see you," and then he disappeared with the groomsmen toward the noise. I felt the empty space he left, the way you feel a door close in a draft. I smoothed the dress and fixed the strap where it liked to slip, and told myself that this was only a photograph, and only a hallway, and only a few hours that would require more patience than skill. In the mirror near the landing, I caught my reflection. The mustard held its color like it meant to me. My face was calm in a way that had taken years to learn. Behind me, someone laughed the bright, loud laugh of a person who does not know what they do not know. I turned toward the sound and followed the flow toward the ballroom. Ballroom doors breathed people in and out, and I let the current pass me by until the noise softened. The smell of citrus and polished wood nudged a memory from the night before, and I let it surface because it mattered more than small talk ever would. The rehearsal dinner had settled into that loose hour when the playlist gets nostalgic and the bar runs on first names. I stood near the end where the lights dim and the staff stages trays. Trevor Cole held court on a bar stool with one sneaker hooked on a rung like he owned the space. He was 33 and wore his confidence like a new jacket. He told the couple beside him that I was on food stamps again. He said it lightly as if it were trivia. The words landed with the quiet thud of a small stone in a deep well. I watched the faces around him tilt. Someone laughed a little and then checked themselves. Trevor added that a friend of his in the media could place stories where they would be seen. He tapped his phone like it was a wand, and the spell had already worked. I did not step in. I took out my phone and texted Tessa to be on. Within minutes, she sent a screenshot from the family group chat. The post was anonymous and lazy, and it used the same awkward phrase Trevor had just used. On stamps again. The timestamp fits. The punctuation, or lack of it, fits. She added that she had confirmed the message lived inside the private group and had not bled into public feeds. She recommended that we log it and prepare a targeted retraction to the exact recipients rather than a broad public flare. I asked her to draft the retraction addressed to all on the family mailing list, the one the wedding planner was using for schedules and seating. I told her not to send yet. I wanted to see the shape of the ripple before we threw a stone of our own. She replied that she would write it and hold for my go, and that she would also pull the original message header she could access from the screenshot source. I felt my breath slow. The wedding planner passed by with a binder that looked like it contained the whole world. I asked whether the family mailing list covered every guest for the weekend. She said yes, and that she could route any official note through it with a single send. I thanked her in a way that made it sound like a logistical question and not a contingency. Back at the bar, Trevor leaned into his friend again. He called him Ben in that careless way people do when they want the room to register a name. Ben Halpern arrived not long after. Mid-40s cool shirt, the kind of handshake that measures and files you. He told Trevor that he could nudge a few things if Trevor wanted morale insurance. He said that reputations are narratives, and narratives can be steered. It was not elegant. It was effective on the kind of audience that wants to be convinced it already knows the truth. I texted Mark Ellison. I asked him to keep an ear out for any placement fee activity connected to a shell that might point to Ben. I said no account numbers in text and no urgency that would leave fingerprints. He sent back a single word, and I could feel the gears engaged somewhere far from this carpet and these candles. For a moment, I opened the family chat and wrote a rebuttal in my head. I wanted to type that the only stamps I had used lately were the postage kind on invitations. I wanted to list the names of people on our payroll whose grocery trips mattered to me more than any seating chart here. I let the draft sit there like a hot plate, and then I deleted every letter. Silence can be a strategy when you choose it. Noise can be consent when you do not. Tessa pinged again. She had pulled metadata from the screenshot source that pointed back to Trevor as the origin. Not proof for a courtroom, enough for a family room. The phrasing match was the nail. My shoulders came down a half inch. She said the retraction was drafted and ready to go to all recipients if and when I wanted it sent. The subject line was clean. The tone was factual. No adjectives. I told her to hold and to keep logging. Ben drifted toward me with the easy smile of a man who never loses his place at a party. He asked how I knew the bride. I said we were family. He told me he helped families shape their stories when they became complicated. There was a glint behind the words. I set my glass down and excused myself before he could make an offer. I was not in the market for fiction. By the time I stepped back into the brighter part of the dinner, the playlist had shifted to sing-alongs, and the speeches were lining up. Trevor was laughing at something on his phone, and Ben was watching the room like a chessboard. I took a slow breath and felt the plan settle. No cease and desist. Not yet. Prepare the retraction to the exact audience. Trace the money if it moved. Identify the hand that paid for the rumor if there was one. Then place one sentence at the right moment and let gravity do the rest. Now in the corridor outside the ballroom, I checked my phone again. Tessa had labeled the file and tucked it where I could approve it with my one tap. Mark had sent a note that he was watching for a transfer pattern he recognized. I slid the phone into my clutch and touched the edge of my wallet where the Polaroid lived. The harpist finished a run and the piano picked up the melody like they had agreed on it years ago. I stepped toward the doors and let the night fold me in. The corridor pressed forward with fragrance and footsteps, but my mind stepped sideways to the hours before the music and the cameras. Earlier that afternoon, I had taken the service elevator up to the rooftop terrace where the air felt cooler and honest. Rain had washed the city and left a shine on the glass towers. I went there to breathe in a space with fewer mirrors. Two voices reached me before I reached the railing. Caleb was speaking with Judge Margaret Whitfield. He had the careful tone he used with people who carried gravitas. He said that his sister worked in a low tier of the food business and that she had never really settled. The words were tidy. The judgment tucked inside them was not. I paused by a planter of rosemary and let the leaves hide me for a moment. Judge Margaret answered with a hum that could mean anything and then shifted the topic to the timing of the ceremony. Caleb checked his watch and adjusted his cufflinks, and I saw the boy he used to be searching for approval with good posture and a polished shoe. They moved toward the stairwell, and then the terrace held only the soft hiss of the city below. I stepped to the edge and let the wind cool my face. A door clicked behind me, and Alan Pierce walked out with the careful tread of a man who knows how to deliver bad news without raising his voice. He greeted me by name and stood beside me rather than in front of me. He looked over the skyline like he was addressing the air. He said the family trust had been established in 2010 and amended in 2016. He said the amendment had removed my name when I was 26 on the grounds that my employment history appeared unstable. He said the decision had been made with caution and concern, and that it could be revisited now that circumstances were different. He did not say the word sorry. He did not need to. It was sitting between us like a third presence. I remember the moment I found out. It was a Thursday, gray and wet, the kind of cold that crept past your coat collar. I was sitting on a plastic bench outside a regional warehouse waiting for a vendor meeting that had just been canceled. My phone buzzed. One new email. Subject Trust Amendment Notification. The PDF was 2 pages crisp legalese in 12-point font. The line that mattered was buried halfway down. The beneficiary status of Ms. Eleanor Bennett shall be revoked effective immediately. No salutation. No explanation beyond lack of long-term financial stability. Just a polite erasure. I remember reading it twice, then a third time, then letting the screen go black in my hand because I could not trust what I was seeing. My breath fogged in the air and the truck dock clattered behind me like punctuation. A colleague waved as she left. I waved back like nothing had changed. The asphalt under my shoes felt farther away than it had a minute before. I looked at the city and not at Alan. I thought about nights in the Safeway stockroom counting cases because numbers never lied to me the way people sometimes did. I said that today was not for legal discussions. I said I appreciated the context, and that we would speak another day when no one was dressed in satin and no one was trying to predict the light. He nodded and said he understood. He moved to leave and then hesitated, as if he wanted to say more and chose not to. He patted the rail with 2 fingers and walked back through the door he had come through. A minute later, the terrace door opened again and my mother stepped out. Diane had that look she wore at holidays, an expression that tried to organize the room with eyebrows alone. She saw me and then saw Alan just inside the doorway, and her face paused the way a song catches on a scratched record. She offered me a remark about the weather that avoided the fact that she had overheard enough to assemble the outline. When I met her eyes, she glanced past my shoulder toward downtown. The silence said more than any sentence. She smoothed the sleeve of her jacket and mentioned that the florist had done a beautiful job. Then she excused herself to check on the seating cards. I watched her go and felt the old ache of wanting her to hold my gaze and let it stay there. My phone buzzed in my palm like a small bird. Ethan had sent a short update. He had pulled background on Ben Halpern and flagged a pattern of paid placements in minor outlets that got recycled into bigger mouths. He advised caution and patience. He added that we had clean corridors for any exit and that he would monitor chatter inside the groomsmen group so that surprises stayed small. I wrote back that we would use silence until silence was wasted, and then we would use a sentence, and I put the phone away. The terrace gave me one last quiet minute. I watched a ferry slide across the bay like a slow thought. I let myself consider the trust and the year 2016 and the person I had been at 26. I had been building the bones of a company and hiding the scaffolding because I believed humility was safer than explanation. People had built a story on the silence I had made. Now the cost of that story had arrived at a ballroom dressed as family. The bell inside the hotel sounded like a clear glass struck with a spoon. Guests were being invited to take their seats. A staff member stepped onto the terrace and told me the photographer wanted pre-ceremony candids on the main stairs. I took one more breath and turned toward the door. In the hallway, a clock read exactly 5 in the evening. The tick-tock of it felt louder than it should have. I thought about the calendar block waiting at 7 in Seattle and 10 in Singapore, and the midday disclosure window we had to beat. Time was not a threat. It was a tool if I used it right. I walked the corridor with my shoulders level and my steps unhurried. As I passed the mirror near the elevator, I checked that the mustard strap sat where it should. I looked like a woman going to a wedding. I felt like a woman who had set a boundary and planned her exits. The door to the stairwell opened and a rush of voices met me. I stepped into the sound and let the afternoon become evening. The grand ballroom glowed the way old hotels do when lighting designers have had their say. I found my seat and let the room arrange itself around me as the first courses moved like choreography. Arthur Whitfield stood first. 66 and silver-haired, he thanked everyone for making the day feel like a promise and spoke about perseverance. He rested his hand on the back of Olivia's chair, and applause rose polite and genuine. Dr. Sarah Lynn followed with a story that began in an operating room and ended with a little boy leaving a hospital on his own 2 feet. The room softened around her words. We lifted our glasses, and I felt my hunger wake up in a way that had nothing to do with food. Jason Whitfield stood next. 37 and still carrying the gloss of a recent exit, he said a few careful sentences about luck and grit and the team that helped him sell a company for $58 million. He promised to show Caleb the secret menu at the family steakhouse. Laughter rolled in a friendly wave, and I let it pass through me without sticking. Between toasts, the photographer appeared for a few candids. Marco adjusted a centerpiece by a finger's width, raised his camera, then lowered it for a heartbeat, as if waiting for the room to choose its face. The master of ceremonies announced that the next round would come from the groom's side. The chairs shifted. Napkins were set down. I watched Caleb stand and smooth his jacket. He glanced toward our mother, a quick look that asked a question. Diane gave a small nod, the kind mothers give when the script is familiar. Caleb lifted the microphone with the smile he saved for photographs. He thanked the Whitfields for their welcome, praised Olivia for her grace-touched familiar notes about childhood and inside jokes that play well for people who were not there. Then he turned toward my end of the room. He said that every family has a mix of stars and steady hearts. He said not everyone chases the same kind of success and that humility has its place. He said his sister has always chosen simpler work, that she is the family disappointment, and that she works at a grocery store. The laugh did not land all at once. It started in a few corners and threaded its way across the room like someone pulling string. It was not loud. That made it worse. It was the half-chuckle people offer when they are not sure if it is safe to fully laugh or if the joke was meant for them. At the next table, a woman froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. A man near the back leaned in and whispered something that made the person beside him shift in their seat. A soft clatter of glass came from the far end of the ballroom, someone setting a flute down too quickly. The air thinned. The guest beside me set his glass down with care as if it had become heavy. From behind came a whisper that shaped the words, "Head of Security," with a question folded into it. Marco's camera dipped again. The flash did not go off. He watched instead, lens lowered like a person realizing they had framed the wrong thing. At the head table, Olivia turned toward Caleb, not sharply and not slowly. Her face did not change, but the breath in her shoulders did. A cousin down the line glanced at her phone and then looked up again, unsure whether to document or disappear. I placed my glass on the tablecloth and aligned the stem with its shadow. The strap of the mustard dress had wandered a fraction. I drew it back where it belonged and let my hand rest there for a breath. My eyes lifted to the head table and found Caleb's face still shaped into that smile that wants approval more than it wants truth. I let my gaze move past him to Olivia, whose expression had not yet chosen a side. Then I looked at my mother. She gave the slightest nod again, a tiny echo of the one from a minute earlier, as if confirming the story rather than the sentiment. Across the room, Ethan sat among the groomsmen, posture easy eyes, alive in that way that counts exits without anyone noticing. When our eyes met, he did not move. He did not need to. We had already agreed on the phrase that could turn a moment into an exit and an exit into a statement. He waited for the smallest sign. The MC lifted a hand toward the band and a few opening notes slipped out, then hovered unsure whether the next step was glide or hold. Conversations restarted in fragments. A couple at my table began to talk about cake flavors with sudden interest. Someone else reached for a phone and then thought better of it. I looked straight at the stage where my brother stood with the microphone still warm in his hand. I kept my face untroubled and let the quiet do the work my voice did not need to do. In the space between one breath and the next, the ballroom tilted a degree toward whatever would come, and the steadiness rose in me like a tide. The band hesitated on the downbeat like a bird testing wind. The MC lifted his hand toward the pianist, and the room leaned forward, but the sound did not fully arrive. Caleb still held the microphone, and that smile that needed applause to set. I could feel the air turn delicate the way a surface gets, when a thin layer of ice tries to form. Ethan stood at the head table among the groomsmen. His posture was casual, and his attention was not. I watched his eyes count exits and then return to me. He tapped 2 fingers against the tablecloth in a small rhythm I knew well. Then he rose. He crossed to the MC with the kind of calm that shifts a space without jarring it. He inclined his head and asked for the briefest word for schedule reasons. I saw the MC register the tucks, the roll, the steadiness, and step aside. Ethan turned toward my table and the room folded around his path, as if someone adjusted the lens. A waiter froze mid-pour. A child stopped fiddling with a dessert fork and stared. Conversations that had begun to restart stalled again. The pianist's hand hovered unsure whether the cue was still the same. Across the rooms, guests began to lean not forward, but away slightly the way people do when instinct whispers that the air has changed. He stopped in front of me, and his voice carried just enough. He said, "Ms. Bennett, I'm your head of security. Shall we leave?" For a heartbeat, the ballroom made no sound at all. Then a glass somewhere in the back chimed against a plate, and a ripple of whisper threaded through cloth and flowers. A bridesmaid mouthed, "What the hell," to no one. Someone near the open bar took a step back, and then forward again as if unsure whether they were part of what was happening. A white-haired aunt whispered, "He said security," with a tone that turned the word into myth. Caleb's hand opened. His champagne flute tilted and slipped and broke against the edge of the stage in a bright scatter that felt louder than it was. Olivia's face went still in a way that was not emptiness, but the precise pause of a person recalculating a map. Judge Margaret had been lifting a fork. It stopped mid-air and remained there like a held note. A cousin near the dance floor whispered a question that tasted like "who exactly?" and the word security took on new shape between the tables. Ethan kept his tone even. He said that we had a hard timing window. We have a hard 2-hour window. The board briefing needed to be completed before the window between 12 and 1. If we missed it, closing would move, and so would money and jobs. He said we had 2 hours, and that the helicopter was not necessary because the team had secured a ground route to Boeing Field if travel became the cleanest option. He did not look at anyone in particular as he said it. He did not need to. My phone hummed against my palm as if the message had been waiting for that exact second. Tessa. Another anonymous post had appeared in the family group. The wording mirrored the rehearsal dinner rumor with a little more spice added for people who confuse adjectives with facts. She had logged it and prepared the retraction still holding for my approval. My thumb hovered and then rested. Not yet. Let the room settle into the new physics. I lifted my eyes and met Ethan's. He did not ask again. The phrase had been spoken and the choice sat with me. I nodded once. He shifted to stand half a step to my side, present without eclipsing. The MC glanced from him to me and then to Caleb, whose smile had drained away, leaving the shadow of it like a watermark that would not dry. My mother exhaled once through her nose, short restrained, but full of verdict. She looked not at me but around me, her attention already filing things into categories appropriate, inappropriate, forgettable, unforgivable. For the first time all evening, I felt the old pull to explain myself rise like a reflex. I let it crest and fall. There are moments when explanation is a poor substitute for evidence. There are moments when silence is the only voice that fits the truth. I stood. The chair legs made a soft sound against the floor, and the tables near me turned as one. I smoothed the yellow silk that had become almost a character of its own tonight. I looked at Olivia and saw her searching my face for a cue. I gave her a small nod that meant, "This is still your day, and nothing I do will change that." Ethan's hand indicated the aisle. He narrated the facts again for the room in the same even cadence. "We have a hard window. 2 hours. The board is waiting." He added that he had already disclosed his professional role to both families to avoid misunderstanding. The MC repeated that we would begin dancing after a brief pause, voice bright, trying to catch the music like a kite in light wind. I felt the phone vibrate again. Tessa wrote that the new post had been watched by exactly the same set of recipients as the first, and that the similarities in phrasing were useful. She attached the retraction ready for sending through the wedding mailing list if I wanted to close the loop quietly and clearly. The word useful steadied me. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and let my fingers rest on the clasp. The room began to move in small currents, chairs edging back, napkins, set down, minds adjusting. What I had been to some people a minute ago had changed without me touching a microphone. Ethan angled his shoulder just enough to frame me without shielding me. He did not hurry me. He did not slow me. Someone whispered, "That's her," and no one answered. Not because they didn't know, but because everyone suddenly did. I decided to speak not long and not to defend myself, but to honor the clock that was already ticking and the work that waited across an ocean. I took one step into the open space between tables and drew a breath that filled the mustard dress and settled my ribs. The pianist's hands hovered over the keys. The room tilted toward me, quiet as a chapel before the first hymn. I let the first breath settle and kept my voice even. I said that my name is Nora Bennett, and that I am the founder and chief executive of North Star Supply Systems. I said that I established North Star in 2018 after years of learning the work from the ground. I said that for the fiscal year 2024, our revenue is $3.2 billion. I said that we employ about 22,000 people. I said that we operate in 34 countries and have been carbon neutral since 2022. I said that we serve more than 80 companies on the Fortune 500 and that we partner with a leading e-grocery platform under a confidentiality agreement, which is why I would not be naming it here. I let the numbers sit on the table like they belonged there. The pianist lowered his hands to his lap. A server paused with a tray halfway between two tables, then remembered how to breathe. Someone near the back cleared a throat that had nothing to do with dust. I added that my work is simple at its core. We move food and medicine and essentials across distances and time so that people find what they need when they reach for it. I said that the reason I was preparing to leave early was not to make a scene, but because a board briefing on the Quan Pacific transaction must be completed before the midday disclosure window in Singapore. I said that if we miss that window, the closing will shift, and with it contracts for suppliers and paychecks for families. I said that the clock was not dramatic. It was practical. There is a kind of silence that feels like skepticism looking for a handle. I have seen it in boardrooms and back rooms. I have learned to give it something clean to hold. I said that my work in a grocery store years ago was research as much as wages. I said that standing in a stockroom at 2 a.m. taught me rhythms that turned into routes and inventory models. I said that I did not correct family often because it can sound like bragging when all you mean is clarity. In the third row, a girl no older than college age lifted her phone toward a cousin and then toward the aisle. She had that frank look that belongs to people who have not had time to learn how to disguise surprise. She turned the screen so the rows behind her could see. I recognized my headshot before I recognized the typeface. It was a Forbes profile that listed me on a ranking I never discuss because it tends to change what rooms decide to hear. The girl looked at me, and then at her screen, and then back at me with a small nod like she had found the corner of a puzzle piece that fits. The micro-reactions spread the way light spreads when a cloud moves off the sun. A man near the bar set his napkin very carefully on the table. A woman beside him touched her necklace as if it suddenly weighed more. Marco the photographer did not lift his camera. He lowered it a fraction and watched with his eyes instead. A groomsman took off the small earpiece he had been using for stage cues and let it rest on his collar. Judge Margaret spoke not loud and not long. She said that continued gossip about someone's livelihood can cross into defamation and into a doctrine called false light, and that both are poor choices in a family setting and worse under chandeliers and microphones. She said it with the gravity of a person who would rather not repeat herself. My phone hummed. Tessa's message came through with the calm of a good mechanic. She had sent the request for correction to Trevor through the wedding mailing list so that all original recipients would receive it at once. It was brief and factual, and asked that the false statement be withdrawn and replaced with a correction. No adjectives. No heat. She noted that the second anonymous post had matched the odd phrasing of the first, which would matter later if it had to. I lifted a hand a few inches, not to shush or command, but to set a period at the end of a paragraph everyone had helped write. I said that I respect this family and the family I'm joining. I said that I do not want to spoil a day that belongs to two people who love each other. I said that because of the timing of global markets, I will be leaving shortly to work. I said that the best gift I can give a wedding is to keep my promises to the people who depend on me, and the best gift I can give a family is to tell the truth and keep it short. For a breath, the room did not know which way to lean. Then heads tilted and shoulders adjusted. The bandleader nodded at the pianist, who nodded back. A server found a place to put down the tray and did so. I saw Olivia's shoulders ease by a degree. I saw Caleb glance at the shards of his glass, as if they might know how to put themselves back together. My mother's eyes stayed on the centerpiece, then lifted and flicked past me like a swallow. I felt Ethan 3 steps away present the way a handrail is present there to touch if needed. He did not move. He did not need to. The choice I made had already moved the room. I could feel the pocket of space around me open wider, the kind people give not from fear but from adjustment. I added one last sentence because it was the hinge everything else would swing on. I said that humility is not invisibility, and that I had chosen quiet for years because I believed it was kinder. I said that today I was choosing clarity instead. The pianist found the first chord. It hung in the air like a question finally being heard. I let the shape of the room become itself again and reached for my clutch. Ethan shifted to make an aisle appear where there had not been one a moment before. The MC began to speak in a voice that wanted to reassure everyone that nothing had broken. I stepped back from the open space and let the applause that rose belong to the couple, not to me. The corridor carried the echo of applause like the end of a tide. Ethan widened a path with the kind of courtesy that reads as authority. A cluster of guests drifted after us with the hunger of people who want a closer look at a story as it changes shape. He positioned himself between me and the curiosity, one shoulder to the wall, one palm lifted in a quiet not yet. Olivia reached me first. Her eyes were clear and a little fierce. She said that the dress choice had been thoughtless, that the comments had been worse, and that she wanted to speak alone after the formalities. I told her that I appreciated her coming to me now when it would have been easy to wait until the room was forgotten. Her hand touched my arm for a second, and then she stepped aside as footsteps approached. Caleb came down the hallway with the momentum of a person trying to outpace his own words. He began with a laugh that aimed for casualness. He said it had been a joke, that the room understood that I should not take it to heart. Olivia turned to him with a stillness I had not seen on her face before. She said that it was not a joke, and that he needed to stop calling it one. The small group around us shifted. Someone held a breath and forgot to let it go. Judge Margaret arrived with the gentle gravity of a person who has stood in too many rooms where people pretended words did not wound. She said she was speaking as a family and not as a judge. She said reputational smears in a private group can still cross legal lines and that sloppy talk under chandeliers can turn into statements with consequences. She added that the fastest path back to good manners was a clear correction and a better silence. Ethan kept his stance easy, but his eyes measured the flow of bodies. He asked 4 onlookers to give the couple space, and they did. He adjusted a stanchion to narrow the spill from the ballroom. The noise dropped by a degree. I could feel the floor return under my feet. Alan Pierce approached with a leather folio tucked under his arm and the look of a man who had practiced bringing order to family fires. He said that he had a straightforward package to propose. First, a spoken apology delivered within the circle of both families before the night was over. Second, a written correction to be sent to all wedding guests via the same mailing list the planner had used for schedules sent within 24 hours, clear and factual, no flourishes. Third, a direct message inside the family group where the rumor started, authored by Trevor, withdrawing the statement and apologizing to the same audience that had read it. He said that these steps would be logged and that the matter could rest there provided there was no repeat. Caleb began to say that this was all a misunderstanding. Olivia cut through the sentence with a firm no. She said that he had asked for a laugh and gotten one, and that now he would need to ask for forgiveness and earn it. The words did not raise their voice. They did not need to. I spoke to the air between us the way you speak when you want the record to be clean. I said that I had no desire to sue my family. I said that my boundary was simple. If the smears continued, I would act within the law and without hesitation. If they stopped here with apologies and a correction that reached the same ears as the harm, I would accept that and move forward. I said that my work required me to leave soon and that I hoped to leave with the wedding intact. Diane joined the circle at the edge, hands clasped in the way she held herself when she wanted to appear composed. She looked from Caleb to me and then to Alan. She asked what the written correction would say. Alan kept it plain. He said it would state that a false claim about my finances had circulated in a private group, that it was untrue that it had been withdrawn, and that the family regretted the error. Diane held his eyes for a long second and then nodded. She said she would co-sign the email and that the wording should be respectful and free of excuses. Ethan checked the flow again. He murmured to the staff at the ballroom door, and the doorway narrowed another handwidth. He relayed to me that the head table would be ready for a brief reconvening if we needed a microphone for the apology. Judge Margaret advised that a smaller gathering in the adjacent lounge would be better and would keep the moment from becoming theater. Olivia agreed and said she would handle the logistics with the coordinator. Trevor edged into the hall with a look that tried to be invisible. He was not. Alan addressed him with professional mercy. He said that a withdrawal within the family group needed to be posted now, and that the written correction would follow by email to every guest. He asked if Trevor understood. Trevor nodded, once eyes down. His phone was already in his hand. Ethan stepped close enough to see the message framed and the words unambiguous. He did not hover. He confirmed and stepped back. I felt my phone vibrate. Tessa sent a short message that the withdrawal had been posted in the family group and that she had received a screen capture from a cousin within seconds. She added that the wedding planner had confirmed the mailing list was ready on her end for the broader correction and that she would await Alan's final text. Caleb tried again with softer edges. He said he had meant to honor humility, that he did not realize the language would cut, that stress had made him careless. Olivia placed a hand on his sleeve and told him that explanations could wait until after the apology. Her face held both disappointment and resolve, a difficult combination to carry with grace, and she carried it. I turned slightly so the group formed a circle rather than a line. It made the air feel less like a trial and more like a plan. I said that my only request beyond the apology and the correction was a clean night for the couple. No more whispers that try to turn back the tide. Judge Margaret approved that as if stamping a simple motion. Alan checked his watch. and said we had time to manage the apology before the first dance resumed. Diane exhaled. It sounded like something had unclenched in her chest. She said that she would stand with Caleb while he spoke, and that she would stand with me when the email went out. For the first time that day, she met my eyes and held them. It lasted a breath. It was enough for the hallway. Ethan lifted his chin toward the lounge, and the small group began to move. He let our family pass, and then fell in step behind a quiet guard on a path that had narrowed to the necessary. I felt the vibration of the band pick up on the far side of the wall, a melody stitching itself back together. The wedding would continue. The corrections would too. The line I had drawn felt steady under my feet as we crossed the threshold into the next room. We left through a service corridor that smelled like lemons and metal. Ethan walked a half step ahead, greeting staff by first name as if he had worked there for years. The kitchen hum fell away, and a back door opened to a quiet lane where the cars waited with engines low. The night rain had turned to a mist that made the asphalt look thoughtful. The rear SUV door opened. I slid in and felt the seat cradle me with that particular firmness that says this vehicle has a purpose. The convoy clicked into motion with the soft choreography of habit. The driver murmured into a mic, and the reply came through on Ethan's handset. Route green, 18 minutes to Boeing Field. He met my eyes in the dark interior, and I felt the first knot between my shoulder blades loosen. Downtown lights unspooled along the windows. Ethan scrolled through a secure thread and held the screen a little toward me so I could catch the shape of the updates without needing the exact lines. Mark had sent a note with his precision calm. A placement fee had moved earlier in the week into a shell that tied back to an entity Ben controlled. There was a faint handshake pattern that suggested a small competitor wanted the Quan Pacific close delayed long enough to position a nuisance offer. No account numbers, no drama. The kind of breadcrumb that earns its weight because it does not overstate itself. Tessa's name followed on the thread. She had built a folder marked Tortious Interference with subtabs that made even my organized heart nod. She had mapped timelines, preserved screenshots, and drafted a cover letter that did nothing more than point to the facts. She ended with a line that read, "Ready if needed." I could imagine the set of her jaw when she wrote it. Seattle's stadium lights drifted by like quiet guardians. I let myself breathe out the tension that still clung from the ballroom. The mustard silk rustled when I adjusted the strap, and I almost laughed at myself for caring about a dress after an evening like that. Then I settled my hands in my lap and turned to Ethan. He was looking out the windshield with that steady check of mirrors and shadows he does without thinking. I asked him if tonight was complicated for him. He kept his eyes forward and answered in the way he does when honesty costs, but is worth the price. He said that he and Caleb had been close in college. He said they had traded notes and ramen and borrowed guitars, and believed the world would meet them exactly where they stood. He said that when the rehearsal schedule first landed in his inbox, he knew he would need to declare the conflict between being a best man and being a security director. He said he had told both sides that he would not act on emotion, only on safety and dignity. He unlocked his phone and opened a message from 3 weeks ago. It was to Caleb. He had written that the phrase, family disappointment, was not a joke, that microphones have a way of magnifying harm, that a wedding is a place where kindness should be the script. He scrolled so I could see the timestamp and then put the phone face down on his knee. He said that he had not wanted me to see that unless it became necessary to explain his place tonight. His voice stayed level. The admission threaded a small ache into the air between us. Traffic thinned near the industrial edges of the city. I asked him if he regretted saying yes to the role of best man. The question hung between us like a coat on a hook, waiting for an answer to claim it. He thought for a beat, and then said that he had stood up for an old friend because friendship matters and rituals matter. He said that tonight he stood next to the truth and his duty because those matter more when the two are put in tension. He said that he believed Caleb could still step toward the right thing and that sometimes a hard edge helps a person find their footing. The driver called out a gentle reminder. 10 minutes. The radio repeated the timing back, and the words settled me in a way that only clocks can. I turned my phone over. Tessa had added that Trevor's withdrawal had been posted in the family group and had been seen by the same set of recipients as the original rumor. The wedding planner had confirmed the mailing list was staged for the formal correction. Good lines, clean edges. The work now was to carry the business side through the window that had started this whole cascade. Ethan's handset chirped again. A voice from the lead car updated the perimeter near the fixed base operator building. The gate was clear. The route through the general aviation side was pre-approved. I pictured the small terminal with its quiet chairs and coffee that taste like deadlines. I pictured the conference room where I would change out of yellow into navy and speak a language that has nothing to do with table assignments and everything to do with refrigeration units and last-mile contracts and the strangely beautiful math of moving lettuce and insulin across time zones without losing either. We passed under a green sign that pointed toward the airport. The wipers swept in a steady metronome. Ethan straightened his jacket and then relaxed again. He told me that Hannah Burke was on standby only. No need to spin the rotor tonight. The meeting would happen at the FBO. I nodded and said that I was grateful not to add the noise of blades to a day already filled with the sound of things breaking and mending. The convoy took the last turn with practiced ease. Ahead, chain link and sodium lights. The gate guard lifted a hand, and the barrier edged up. Security checked the plates against the list with that bored efficiency that makes the world safer in ways most people never notice. The SUV rolled forward and the tires made that soft sound that tires make on clean concrete. For a moment, as we eased onto the tarmac side lane, I watched a small jet taxi pass like a quiet intention. I thought about the college kid Caleb had been and the best man Ethan had been asked to be, and the sister I had learned to be inside the narrow expectations of our family. I thought about how roles can harden around people until they forget they are allowed to choose again. Then I looked ahead. The FBO doors glowed with practical light. The SUV came to a stop under the awning. A ground handler stepped out with a clipboard and a calm nod. Inside the glass, I could see a conference room set with bottled water and a stack of non-disclosure forms because some places know me by my needs before I arrive. Ethan stepped out first and offered a hand I did not need but took anyway because there are kinds of steadiness worth accepting. The driver announced our arrival in that quiet radio voice that always sounds like the right size. Everything up to the door worked the way good planning makes things work. The rest would be on me. The FBO lobby smelled like fresh coffee and clean carpet. A receptionist with practiced calm waved us toward a small conference room where bottled water waited in a neat triangle. I stepped into the ladies' room with a navy suit already on a hanger. The mustard dress slipped over my head and into a garment bag with the soft rustle of a chapter ending. The jacket settled on my shoulders like a decision I had already made. Ethan checked the door and the windows, and then stood at the far wall where he could see both the hallway and the screen. I opened my laptop and the familiar grid of faces blinked in. Lydia Cho appeared first steady and watchful, then the rest of the board, then two outside advisors whose haircuts said they had been on planes all month. We rolled straight into the agenda. The banker spoke to funding lines and the hedges that kept currency from biting us. Legal spoke to filings queued for release after midday in Singapore. Then a director cleared his throat and asked in the careful tone people use when they think discretion equals softness, why a wedding had required a public show and whether I was letting emotion come to work. The question sat on the table and looked at me. I kept my shoulders down and let the answer be numbers before it was narrative. On time in full sits above 98% for the trailing 12 months. Spoilage is down 23% in 24 months. The operating plan assumes synergy run rate within 4 quarters of close. Capital expenditures remain inside the audit corridor. I left the ballroom to protect the cutoff for the briefing we are having now, so that we meet the midday disclosure window in Singapore between 12 and 1. If we miss it, we shift closing and send a ripple into suppliers who do not deserve our carelessness. I told them the facts as if I were sliding tools across a bench. The director nodded once and wrote something I did not need to read. Lydia tilted her head the smallest amount and then said she had something for the room. The screen changed to a video tile, fluorescent light, a stockroom wall painted a tired gray. Ruth Park stood in frame with the same ponytail I remembered from a decade ago. She said in her unhurried way that years back, I had worked the night shift at her store, and that during one hard season in 2015, we rotated inventory and reworked ordering and saved the produce budget from falling apart. She said it was as simple as a grocery list. She did not try to make it pretty. She did not need to. The room went quiet in that full way that means people are actually listening. I reached into my clutch and placed the small Polaroid on the table next to my notebook. A hairnet and a barcode scanner and a grin that makes more sense to me now than it did then. The plant returned to soil. The sight of it steadied my breathing in a way no talking ever does. Mark joined the call from a fluorescent corner on our operations floor. He carried a good kind of urgency. He confirmed a placement fee moving into a shell tied to Ben and an indirect link to a minor competitor who benefits if we slide the Quan Pacific close. He recommended we continue to let the breadcrumbs be what they are and not turn them into conclusions before we need to. We nodded our way down that path. Tessa chimed in from a quiet office where the blinds drew perfect lines across the wall. She recommended no comment on pending transactions for any external queries that might pop up from the wedding chatter, and reminded us that the targeted retraction to the family group had been sent through the same mailing list the planner used. She had logged the second anonymous post and preserved its metadata. Her voice had that even quality that makes fires smaller. We turned to the deck that actually moves money. Supply constraints in 2 corridors. Contingency carriers in place. Dry ice allotments secured. Contracts in Asia ready to flip state once the board signed off. I answered the questions with the comfort of muscle memory. When an advisor pressed on risk controls, I walked him through temperature excursions and lane diversions and the cadence of those alerts when they show up on the screen at 2 a.m. He stopped tapping his pen. Lydia brought us back to the second page where the authorizations live. She asked for signatures so filings could be released once the midday clock rolled. I signed where the flags were. Wet ink on 3 copies and a digital on the pad for the counsel who likes both. I reminded the room that our public references must stay aligned. $3.2 billion in revenue, roughly 22,000 employees, 34 countries. I asked communications to sanity check every draft for those 3 anchors, so we do not fight ghosts of our own making. The director who had questioned me earlier leaned in toward his camera. He said that the business case was solid and that the board appreciated the clarity. Lydia closed the loop with a summary that hit dates and dependencies with no extra adjectives. She looked past the screen as if she could see the runway lights through my wall and said we were on pace. I closed my laptop and watched the reflection of the room gather itself on the dark screen. The navy suit felt like purpose rather than armor. Ethan shifted closer and updated me in a few quiet sentences. The perimeter remained clear. Ground time to the hotel if needed was short. Hannah stayed on standby. The window in Singapore would open soon enough that we could breathe without sprinting. I picked up the Polaroid, held it a second, then slid it back into the wallet. The receptionist knocked softly and set a better pot of coffee on a side table, because she had guessed the exact moment it would be welcome. I thanked her and poured half a cup. The steam fogged the edge of my glasses, and the world blurred for a heartbeat before it snapped back into clean lines. The work was in motion. The filings would march at noon in Singapore. The correction would meet the rumor in the same inboxes that had swallowed it. I stood and the chair legs made a gentle sound against the carpet. Ethan opened the door with that small nod that means the hallway is ours for the moment. The night outside the glass looked steady. So did I. Morning gathered against the Fairmont windows like a soft decision. A private room off the lobby had been set with coffee and the kind of chairs meant to keep people from posturing. Judge Margaret arrived first and stood not at the head but slightly to the side, a signal that today she was family and not a robe. Ethan took a quiet place near the door. Alan laid a folio on the table and waited with the patience of a man who knows paper can hold heat. Caleb and Olivia came in together. He looked older by night. She was steady in the way of someone who had spent the dark hours choosing what she would stand for. Diane followed, hands folded, eyes careful. Trevor drifted in last and avoided every gaze at once. The wedding planner slipped in with an iPad and a calm nod and took the chair by the wall where mailing lists live. Judge Margaret set the tone the way a metronome sets time. She said this was a conversation among relatives. She asked that we keep our words plain. Then she invited Caleb to speak. My brother looked at the table first, and then at the faces he had known since childhood. He said he was sorry without ornaments. He said he had tried to be charming and had chosen a language that humiliated his sister in front of two families. He said the line he crossed was not a joke and that he had crossed it on purpose. He said he would not defend himself. He asked to be allowed to repair what could be repaired. The room held still around the sentences. For once there was nothing for anyone to applaud. Olivia reached for his hand and did not let the gesture do the talking. She said change would begin in their house and that she would help him keep that promise where it counts. The words were simple and landed well because they did not try to be large. Alan turned a page in the folio and spoke to the correction plan. A spoken apology had just been delivered to both sides of the family. A written correction would go to every guest through the same wedding mailing list within 24 hours. A withdrawal would be posted inside the family group by the originator of the rumor, with clear language owning the falsehood. He looked to the planner. She confirmed the mailing list was staged and ready, and that she would send at the time specified. Trevor signed the printed retraction and handed it back with the small movements of a person who suddenly understands scale. He opened the family group on his phone and typed with Ethan watching for clarity and Alan watching for content. The message went live. The planner's iPad chimed. A cousin forwarded a screen capture within seconds. Tessa texted me a quiet confirmation from her office, even though no one had asked her to. Systems working as designed feels like mercy. Alan shifted to the trust. He summarized the history while removing the sting. Established 2010. Amended 2016. The amendment had removed me at 26 years old under the label of instability. He presented a draft restoration effective this year with an additional clause. The apology clause set an expectation that public disparagement inside family channels or at family events triggers an automatic review. A repeat would activate a 6-month suspension of family financial representation rights for the party at fault. That meant no signatures on behalf of shared assets and no authority to speak for the family's funds during that period. He set a pen on the line and waited. Diane asked to read the email that would go to guests. The planner handed her the tablet. She read silently, then aloud, so the room could hear its own tone. The message stated that a false claim about my finances had circulated, that it was untrue and withdrawn, that the family regretted the error, and that we hoped everyone would keep the focus on the couple. Diane looked up, met my eyes for the first time that morning, and said she would co-sign that message. She asked that her name be placed next to mine and Caleb's and Olivia's. Something inside my chest moved a fraction toward ease. Alan looked at me before he spoke again. With my consent, he shared a quiet fact that had lived in the dark since 2018. That year, a medical bill in our family had arrived like a storm. An anonymous donor had paid it in full. The donor had been me. The table made a new kind of silence. Diane's fingers found the edge of the tablet and held it as if a wave had passed through her and she needed a railing. She looked at me, not past me, not through me. Understanding can be loud without a sound. I said that we could leave that detail in the room and not make it part of any message. It had not been offered for credit then, and it did not need credit now. What mattered was that trust includes respect the same way it includes numbers. I signed the restoration draft. Caleb signed the apology letter. Diane added her name to the outgoing email. Olivia signed both and steadied the paper with her left hand while she did it. Trevor cleared his throat and said he had posted the withdrawal and that he would answer any replies inside the group with the same clarity. Judge Margaret nodded once and said that would be wise. She reminded us that the quickest way to heal a cut is to stop touching it. Alan scheduled the mailing list sent for the afternoon so that the inboxes that had swallowed the rumor would receive the cure in the same way. We stood. Chairs made small sounds on the carpet. Ethan opened the door to the hallway and checked the flow. The planner slipped out to prepare her team for the send. Caleb stopped by me, not blocking my path, not reaching, simply standing near enough to be heard without drawing the room into it. He said he would do better. He did not ask for anything in return. It was the right size. Diane touched my arm, a light contact that could have been a question. Her eyes were damp in the way that makes makeup fragile. She said nothing about donors or dollars. She said that she would be at lunch when I was ready, and that we could try a new start that did not require anyone to be a disappointment to anyone. I nodded because anything more would have been too much for a morning that had already carried more than its share. We filed out into the quiet of the hotel hallway. The sun pushed through a break in the clouds and traced a bright line across the carpet. The day felt possible. That was enough. By the end of the week, the city felt rinsed and new. I stood on the rooftop of our South Lake Union office and watched the last light comb the water into calm. Vents hummed like a steady breath. A gull rode a pocket of air and disappeared behind the neighboring roofline. My phone buzzed in my hand with the kind of news that lets your shoulders fall where they belong. Lydia wrote that internal approvals were complete and we were green for closing early next week. She added a line about teams sleeping in shifts and waking on time. Gratitude moved through me like warm air. I thanked her and reminded us to keep our numbers aligned, then set the phone on the ledge and let my eyes take the long view that comes after a hard thing clicks into place. Another vibration. Tessa reported that Ben Halpern had removed the content and accepted the warning letter without argument. The correction email had reached every guest through the same mailing list that had carried seating charts and schedules. Trevor had been removed from the family group after his apology. Screenshot receipts sat in the file like neat stones. I could see her tabs in my mind and could hear the steadiness of her voice even through a line of text. The elevator doors opened behind me and a small wind crossed the roof. No one stepped out. The building sighed and settled. I thought of the yellow dress folded in a garment bag and felt a smile tug at one corner of my mouth. That dress had done its work. It had made me visible to myself. For months I'd been thinking about replacing my car. The old sedan in the garage carried a loyal rattle and a heater with a mind of its own. I opened the Notes app and wrote a different plan. Rural Washington Cold Chain Fund. I pictured refrigerated vans making the last miles to pharmacies where the nearest hospital is far. I pictured small clinics with dependable coolers and the way a mother breathes easier when medicine sits where it should. The money I had set aside for leather seats looked better as compressors and insulated doors. I moved from Notes to banking and sent an initial transfer now that the board had cleared the path. The confirmation pinged with a quiet finality that felt right. Warm air on insulin, fewer hours between need and the hand that meets it. I let that picture settle until it held. My phone lit again. A message from my mother. Short and careful in a way that felt new. Lunch on Tuesday if it worked, and a single rule of no talk about money. I read it twice. I wrote yes and suggested a small cafe near Volunteer Park where the coffee is kind and the chairs do not rush you. She replied with a heart written out in words. I let the small miracle of that rest where it could do the most good. Ethan sent his next. He forwarded the security schedule for the coming week and noted that Monday's route to the boardroom had been tightened around a street closure. At the end he wrote that the mustard dress seemed like a good luck charm and he hoped it would never have to work that hard again. I laughed in a way I did not need to hide and told him he had earned a quiet weekend. He answered with a thumbs up written like a word and a promise to check the perimeter before the building yawned awake. I slid a hand into my wallet and brought out the small Polaroid. The stockroom under fluorescent light. The hairnet. The grin that could light an aisle. I held it by the white edge and thought about the years I spent trying to be small, so other people could feel large about the way silence can begin as grace and harden into a costume that rubs the skin raw. I tuck the photo back where my driver license lives. A compass belongs beside the proof of who you are. I turn to the skyline and let the week line up behind me like pages you can close without tearing. The filing sequence in Singapore would run as planned. The correction had met the rumor in the same inboxes that had carried it. The apology had been spoken and written. The trust had been mended with rules that would hold when memory went soft. Tuesday had a table waiting for a conversation that did not require winners or losers. The car could wait. The fund could start work. The air cooled, and the roof went a deeper blue. I checked the time and pictured Lydia finally eating something green. I pictured Tessa archiving the last receipt and Mark lining up his next set of numbers with the calm of a person who likes clean columns. I pictured my mother choosing a blouse that was more about comfort than performance, and both of us learning how to keep talking on the ground where it can grow. My phone buzzed once more, the last small bell of the day. A note from Olivia that read, like a hand on a shoulder. The first week of marriage had shown her that honesty and softness are not opposite ends of a rope. She asked for a few books on boundaries. I sent 3 titles that helped me and told her I was proud of the way she stood in that hallway. There was nothing else to add. I stood still and looked out over the neighborhood that held me when it would have been easy to run. I let the quiet do its work. Then I said the last thing out loud, because hearing it in the air matters. Humility is not invisibility. You can choose quiet without choosing to disappear. A name someone says into a microphone is not the truth of you. The truth is the work you do and the lines you draw and the way you keep your promises when no one is clapping. If this story keeps you company tonight, and you want more tales where revenge finds its shape inside family and betrayal and karma, stay with this channel and share the moment that changed your view of what you heard today. There are more rooms like this one, and more women ready to speak in them.